Hello friends, welcome to another theoretical lecture on non-ferrous metallography and characterization techniques or laboratory. So this is supposed to be a practical course. However, since some amount of theoretical knowledge is required for any practical studies, I will be attempting to deliver that theoretical aspect of this practical course in this lecture. Now, in the previous lecture, we saw about a material, or rather an element and their alloys, which was with us for a very, which is with us, or which has been with us for a very long time. That was copper, and we saw that the first time copper was used by us humans was around in the year or around the year 9000 BC. So it is close to like 11,000 years before we've been using copper. However, the material or the metal and its alloys that we are going to look today is quite, or when you compare to copper, is very recent. So this material or this element or this non-ferrous metal and its alloy was discovered, at least in the industrial scale, in the late 19th centuries. So it's just been little more than 100 years that we've been using this particular non-ferrous element or non-ferrous metal and its alloys. Now, even though we were able to extract it, even though we were able to process it at the industrial level in the late 19th centuries, a mineral of it we've been using for some time, and this mineral of this particular non-ferrous metal, which we have been using, particularly not as how typically a metal would be used, but since it being a mineral, it had its own application. And this mineral is often referred to as, or colloquially it was referred to as bitter salt. Now, I don't know if anyone has come across this name, and if you have done, now you would be able to relate which non-ferrous metal we are about to discuss. Now, when I give away the name of this mineral, you will right away be able to relate the non-ferrous element that we are going to study with the mineral that we want to begin with. So the name of this mineral is alum, and of course in this lecture, if you, it is easy for you to relate that in this lecture what we will be discussing about is aluminium and their alloys. Now, when you talk about alum, it was in the year 1754 that it was first realized that the alum, a compound material, or in our terms or in recent terms, compound, comprised of two definite substances. So this compound, they comprised of two definite substances. It was realized in 1754, and the properties of these two definite substances were different. One of the substances that constituted this alum was rather similar to that of any salt. It was brittle, but the other substance that formed this alum was unlike any other salt. It had its own unique properties, and it was difficult to characterize this particular substance that contributed to, or that constituted the alum to salt. So this was the first, rather when you talk about the historical developments in aluminium, this was the first point wherein people began to realize that this alum, which was a compound substance which comprised of more than one substance, it had in it a different substance that has a property which is unlike any other salt that was considered at that time. So this was a beginning, or this was a starting point for people to be concerned or to be intrigued about this alum, meaning that this alum had something in it that was different from any other salts, and this was the starting point for our aluminium, or discovery of aluminium. And it took around or close to another 50 years till this guy came along, this rather decent looking guy, he came along. And I guess you might have already known his name. His name is Humphrey Davy. You might have heard about Humphrey Davy's lamp. And he was at that time in the year 1807, or in the early years of 19th century, he was working on ways to extract different metals using electrolytic refining. So that was his focus. So he was attempting to extract or separate different metals from their ore using electrolytic refining. And while doing that, he came across this alum, and he attempted the same, and he was the first one to separate aluminium from alum. Now the reason we have this name aluminium, or sometimes if you want to talk to your American, if you have any American friends, or if you go through any American literatures, you would see it being referred as aluminum. But there is one rather justifiable reason why this was referred to as aluminium, because when you talk about the context of its discovery, meaning when Humphrey Davy worked on alum to extract aluminium from alum using electrolytic refining, he also worked on other several elements or several metals. For instance, he worked on potassium, he worked on sodium, and he worked on calcium. So Em is the term that he often attributed to the metal that he extracted from the minerals. So in that way, if IUM is the term that he added to the element that he extracted, in that sense he extracted this aluminium or this new element from alum, and to be consistent, he included the name IUM, and that's the reason why it is convenient, or it is rather justifiable to say aluminium rather than alum. So it's just the etymology of the name. So the aluminium, we get the name aluminium from one of its mineral that was initially used to extract this particular non-ferrous metal from, and that is the reason why. And since given the name of the mineral and the era it was discovered in, by the person it was discovered by, he referred to that as aluminium. Now in the subsequent years, processing techniques developed, and the first measurable amount of aluminium was extracted in the year 1854. The reason one need to understand the difference between its initial discovery and this 1854 or the extraction made in 1854 is because in the initial discovery or in the early years of 19th century, the extraction was a very small amount. It was just the development of the processing technique to extract aluminium. But in the year 1854, it was not Humphrey Davy but someone else who worked on aluminium extensively, but based on Humphrey Davy's approach, and they were able to extract a considerable amount of aluminium from alum or similar other minerals. And the reason why we need to focus on this considerable amount or measurable amount is because only when you have a measurable amount or a decent amount of aluminium being extracted, you will be able to study its properties and quantify it and differentiate it with respect to or against any other metal that you have extracted. So even though this alum, we've been using alum for a very long time, at least for dyeing purposes. It was in the year 1754 when we had understood that this alum comprised of two essential components, and one was certainly different from other salts. And in 1807 or the early years of 19th century, Humphrey Davy, he gave us an approach for extracting aluminium from alum, and it was developed, and after close to 50 years, we were able to extract a certain amount of aluminium from a given mineral. Now we can think about or talk about several processing or developments in the processing technique. I guess you are taking some course on non-ferrous extraction, and maybe you could relate it to that. Of course, that is interesting. But there are easier ways or simpler ways to talk about this advancements in the processing technique. So let us choose that rather concise and the simpler way of doing it. Now, for the first time, when aluminium was presented as a unique or a separate non-ferrous element, it was presented in the year 1855 in an exhibition at Paris, and at that time the cost of production was 130 pounds or sterling per kg. So if you equate it to today's amount, it is close to around 3,100 pounds per kg. So production cost was aluminium at that era, like 1855, was around close to like 3,100 pounds per kg. To that period, it was 130 pounds per kg. And just in 30 years of span, we got reduced significantly to 5.5 pounds per kg. And at the end of 19th century, the amount or the cost of production was even further reduced and ultimately reached somewhere around 0.44 pounds per kg. And this reduction in the production cost facilitated the industrial scale production of aluminium and its usage. Now, one of the reasons, if you think about it, one of the reasons for this reduction in the the decrease in the production cost of aluminium is because, as the moments before, as I've said, the the approach that was taken to extract aluminium was with the use of electricity, that is electrolytic refining. And when the cost of electricity or the production of electricity was decreased, or when the electricity was made abundant, it was made available to everyone, correspondingly the production cost of aluminium decreased. And this is something that one could relate how the evolution in the metallurgy would also correspond to the evolution in the technology. So what was around 3000 or what was around 130 pounds per kg just 50 years before became close to or less than half a pound a kg. Pound meaning pound sterling, I'm talking about the currency that is used in UK. So it became the reduction was so heavy that the production was the decrease in the production cost was so high that the industrial scale manufacturing of aluminium began. Now let us move into away from this historical aspect and let's focus now on our understanding or our objective to understand what are the different alloys that are available in aluminium and how well we can process them in order to view them or in order to view their microstructures. Now, when you compare this aluminium with several other non-ferrous metals, aluminium has a unique feature being that the alloys of aluminium, they have a wide range of composition. So of course there are several when we talked about copper, it had also several alloys making several alloys that for which the base metal was copper. Similar to that, we have aluminium alloys as well, but the chemical composition range is so wide, and therefore each of these chemical composition they need a separate designation, or they have to be treated as a separate alloy. And when you compare this aluminium alloys to several other non-ferrous metals, their range is quite huge, and this is one of the characteristic features of aluminium alloys. So when one talks about aluminium alloys, they have to remember that you have to be very specific on which alloy you are talking about, because there are a huge range of aluminium alloys that are available. Of course, even for other non-ferrous metal, you have to be specific, but at least 2 or 3 composition would do for other non-ferrous metals or non-ferrous base metals. But in case of aluminium, you have to be very specific on which are the base metals and what are their percentages. And if you want to quantify, so what are these wide range of alloys or what are the wide range of compositions? So there are around more than 300 alloys that are actually listed. These are alloys that are universally accepted, and they have their universal codes. And just these alloys they constitute around 3000, or rather over 300. So there are over 300 alloys which are universally relevant, and people they use definite codes for these 300 alloys. And this number of listed alloys is so it works with what makes your aluminium unique. So I guess all the rest, when you consider all the rest of the non-ferrous metals and their alloys, it won't if you consider them separately, it won't amount to this much amount or this much number of alloys, particularly when they are listed. Of course, locally you can manufacture in-house certain alloys and use it for a particular purpose, but when you want to get it listed, meaning you have to give a universal designation, it has to be approved, and the application has to be so vast. And the aluminium and their alloy have found such a place in the application arena as well. Therefore, there are more than 300 alloys listed for aluminium. Now, since even though there are wide range of chemical composition and there are over plethora of aluminium alloys, there are 2 elements that constitute every aluminium alloy. So even they are found in at least measurable amounts in every aluminium alloys. So these 2 elements are iron and silicon. So if you want to talk about an aluminium alloy or a pure form of aluminium, you would find there are traceable amounts of iron and silicon. With the reason for it, of course, again, when you consider its processing technique, you will understand why you could find the traceable amounts of iron and silicon. But to our understanding or to the consideration of this study, it is important to realize that there are traceable amounts of these 2 elements, that is iron and silicon, in whatever aluminium alloy you are talking about. Now, when we talk about alloy, we need a system to designate it, and particularly when we want to consider the practical application, the practical laboratory aspect of aluminum or handling and non-ferrous metal, we need to designate each and every metal separately. We need to designate each and every alloy separately, so that it will be helpful for us to assign a particular metallography technique to a particular alloy. The reason is, we have more than 300 alloys in aluminum. We have a definite designated system which we have to adopt. Only then we would be able to attribute a definite or a set of metallography techniques to that particular alloy, and that's the reason why we have this universal number designation system. So let's see what are the different designations that are given to different aluminum alloys. So, like what we saw for copper, we have a very well defined designated system, and it begins with series 1, and the subsequent, the numbers that succeed this 1 or any other numbers that are mentioned in this series, they might vary, but the principle, based on the principal alloying element, these different designations are being assigned. So the first one, that is 1XX, or the series that begins with 1, is pure aluminum, and generally it comprises of more than 99% of aluminum, and the property that we get from this alloys, which is of pure aluminum, is that it is corrosion resistant, and it has a very high electrical conductivity, and because of these properties it is used in manufacture of the chemical tanks, and also in the bus bars, rather the conductivity, or the bars which are or the wires, rather huge size wires which carry current. So we have our first series, or the first designation, that is 1 followed by other digits, and this refers to pure aluminum, which generally comprises of more than 99% of this non-ferrous metal, and the properties that it corresponds to is corrosion resistance, electrical conductivity, and correspondingly its applications are. Now the second series of aluminum alloys, it comprises of copper, and the copper, when you include it or when you combine with it with aluminum, when you form an alloy with aluminum and copper, the strength of that aluminum or the base metal increases, and particularly this strength holds at relatively high temperature. So again, when you talk about high temperature, it is relative to the melting point of that alloy. So when you in that context or in that range of temperature, the strength is significantly retained, and therefore it is used for aerospace applications. So when you want to see, or when you want to look at, when you want to study an aluminum alloy that is used in aerospace applications, you have to know that the alloying element that is significantly present in that alloy is copper. Now the other series, the next series, that is the one that begins with 3, the alloying element that is present in it is manganese. The manganese, when included into or when added as an alloying element to the aluminum, increases the corrosion resistance of the material, and it also ensures that the metal is formable, and you can manufacture or you can process it in such a way that you get your desired shape. So owing to this corrosion resistance and the formability of the material, this particular alloy is used in manufacturing or building heat exchangers. Now the next series in this UNS system, or rather in the UNS designation, is 4X series, and this particular alloy comprises of aluminum and silicon. Now aluminum and silicon, they form a huge range of alloys, and these huge range of alloys they are both treatable and not heat treatable. So you can change the chemical composition of silicon in such a way that you have a definite categories of alloy that are heat treatable, and the other definite categories of alloy that are not heat treatable. Now I don't know if you have already come across aluminum alloys in your non-ferrous course, but you will understand that what is the difference between heat treatable and non-heat treatable alloys of aluminum, and what significant role that these different sets of alloys play. So they have two different sets of a given alloy, and some alloys are non-heat treatable and some are heat treatable, and each of these have a specific role in our applications, and you will understand why these are not heat treatable and why these are heat treatable, and you will also know what are the specific applications they are used in. And to put it in general terms, to just when you consider the whole of the 4x alloys of aluminium, that is aluminium silicon alloys, they are used as filler materials in building. Now let's move on to the next series of aluminium alloys, that is 5x aluminium alloys. Now these are combinations of aluminium as the base metal and magnesium as the alloying element. Now these combination of alloys, there are alloys in this combination that render us higher strength and they are weldable in nature, meaning individually they give us they have good mechanical strength, and also it is possible for us to use welding techniques in order to join them. So given these combination of properties, this aluminium alloys or this series of aluminium alloys are used in shipbuildings, bridges and pressure vessels. So they have some structural applications to them given their properties, and they are used in these known applications. Now the other series of aluminium alloys, that is the 6x, it comprises of in addition to magnesium, it also comprises of silicon. So there are two alloying elements that are dominant in these series. So far what we have seen is one alloying element dominates the series or the numbering system or the alloys. So far when you talk about till the 5x series, it's a combination of aluminium and one alloying element. Now the sixth is quite different. It has two alloying elements, magnesium and silicon. Now this combination of two alloying elements with the base metal aluminium, it gives you high strength. It is not the highest strength, but it gives you good or decent amount of strength, and these are used in making structural components. If you want to have, if you see a component that is a part of a different of a whole structure, and it is rather it is in that place just as a structural component, or it gives a structure to that system, or it comprises of an apparatus or rather a contraption wherein you find this gives this particular metal or an alloy gives a structural support, then the combination, and you know that this is made of aluminium as the base metal, and generally the combination that would make such an alloy that would form a structural compound is magnesium and silicon. So let's move to the other series, that is 7x series. And similar to that of 5x series, some of the aluminium alloys which offer highest resistance are found in this series. And this series, again we go back to our normal case wherein we have a single alloying element that is dominant, and this alloying element in the 7x series is zinc. So the combination of aluminium and a single dominant alloying element, that is zinc, would give us the 7x series of alloys. And like I said, some of the alloys with highest strength are found in the series of aluminium alloys. And owing to their strength, they are used in aerospace application, and also a unique place wherein these particular aluminium alloys are used is in the sports equipments, and when you need a metal to offer the properties that are expected, and which like the high strength and also certain amount of formability, people usually use this 7x series aluminium alloy. And finally we have our 8x series, and this comprises of all the and when you have, except for these alloying elements, when you have other alloying elements, it is generally termed as 8x alloys. Now when you want to talk about the properties of these 8x series of alloys, then it would mean that you have to be specific about which other alloying element is getting into the series, and therefore depending on which alloying element will get into the series, the properties would vary, and correspondingly their applications would vary. And therefore I'm not given any specific description of what these 8x series comprises of, but when you want to talk about this 8x series, you cannot just talk about 8x series, you have to be even more specific of which alloying element is going into this aluminium base metal. So it could be either the combination of all the others we have seen in the preceding series, or it could be something new. So that would comprise of this 8x aluminium alloys. Now all these alloys are wrought alloys, and we have seen that when we talked about copper, the designation of wrought alloys will be different from that of the cast alloys. So if you want to talk about the designation, that is the UNS designation for the cast aluminium alloys, it looks something like this. Now at the very outset you could see that when you have something, when you have a dot in your UNS designation and there is a number that follows this dot, then it means that we are talking about cast aluminum alloys. We are no longer talking about wrought aluminum alloys. When you have a dot and there is a number that follows this dot, then it would mean that we are talking about, we are no longer confined to wrought aluminum alloys, we are focusing on cast aluminum alloys. Now let us see what other differences are there in terms of the designation. And as you can see in the 3x series of alloys, in the wrought alloys, the 3x meant the major composition or the major alloying element was manganese, but in case of cast alloys, it is the combination of 3 or rather 2 plus or 1 combination of these alloying elements. So the major alloying elements in case of cast alloy that belong to 3x series is silicon, copper, and it may or may not have magnesium. So this is one of the difference when you compare the designation for wrought and the cast. The other difference is, as you can see here, the 6x in case of wrought alloys was confined to, or it was attributed to magnesium and silicon. However, the equivalent, or at least for the namesake, the equivalent ones in the cast alloys, that is 6x.x. This series of alloys, it is rather not used. You cannot find, at least in the commercial level, you cannot find any aluminum alloys or aluminum cast alloys with this designation. So I don't really know why, but maybe one of you could find. But one reason that is given or that is often speculated is in order to avoid certain degree of overlap, people have left this 6x to be unused, or they have left this to be alone, and they have not used this because when you talk about manganese and silicon in case of cast alloy, it has already been magnesium and silicon in cast alloys, it has already been covered in 3 and 5x. And in order to avoid in wrought alloys, you have a combination of it that is designated separately as 6x, and in order to avoid another set of combination in cast, and in order to avoid a confusion, this particular designation is not used. This is speculations of some of the authors of one particular author has speculated this. The other difference when you compare the designation of wrought and cast alloy is the last one, that is 8x series. In 8x series, all the others or the combinations of the preceding alloying elements in case of wrought alloys are categorized as 8x, or it is being it has been put together in 8x series in case of wrought alloys. But in case of cast alloys, the 8x series means that you have a definite combination or a definite combination of a base metal and an alloying element, and that alloying element is tin. So only when you have tin in aluminium, in the cast system, you would refer to that in the 8x series. Now, others in the cast aluminium alloys are referred to as categorized under 9x series, and when one talks about cast aluminium alloys pertaining with starting with 9, or the designation that begins with 9, and it means that it uses or the alloying element that constitute this particular series of aluminium alloys is either the combinations of one that precedes the other, that characterizes the other series in cast alloys, or it could be something new. So the 8x in the wrought alloys is equivalent to that of the 9x in the cast alloys. So these are the different ways the different aluminium alloys are being designated using UNS system. So this gives you just an overview of what are the different combinations of alloys that are possible just when you focus on one base metal and one alloying element. So just by the combination of one base metals and one alloying element, you could see that the aluminium alloys, they have a definite, or rather they have like close to 8 or 9 series, and depending on the composition of this primary alloying element and other alloying element, each of these series they assume a definite number, and like we have seen, we have more than 300 alloys that are listed, meaning we have more than 300 of these series that are used in application that are already defined, and which are defined, and they have definite properties, and therefore they are used in definite application. So now let's move away from this UNS designation and see what are the difficulties, or why one should focus on aluminium, or the focus on the large number of alloying elements, or the wide range of compositions that comprise or that make up the aluminium alloy. So what is the relevance of that to the study of metallography or characterization? After all, we are studying about metallography and characterization. Now one needs to relate the different or the wide range of chemical composition that constitute this aluminium alloys to our present aim. So the reason is one need to focus on the different aluminium alloys is because when your chemical composition of a particular aluminium alloy varies, that means the properties also varies, particularly that properties that are relevant to metallographic. So in metallography, in the first lecture we saw that it involves different techniques, and these techniques that we have to choose from the different or various available techniques that are available to us. And when we want to choose a particular set of techniques from the different ways that are available to us, these should be relevant to, or this selection is based on the properties of the alloys that we want to study. So depending on the property of the alloy, or you have to know the property of the alloy, and based on the property of the alloy, you will choose a particular set of techniques from the available ones. And now when you have an alloy wherein you have a very wide range of composition, that meaning you have a very wide range of alloys, then it would mean that corresponding or based on your composition, your properties would vary, and based on your properties, since your properties vary widely, then it would mean that you have to have a specific set of metallographic steps for each and every alloy. And that is the reason why we in this lecture we introduced the different alloys that are present in aluminium, and the different composition that characterizes each of these alloys. And depending on, only when you understand the properties of this alloy, you will be able to choose the appropriate metallographic technique. Now, what are the properties of these alloys that are relevant to us? That is important for us to understand. And what are the properties that change when you change the chemical composition? So if you look in that way, so one of the property is that the melting point. As you can see here, with the change in the primary or the principal alloying element, there is a significant change in the average melting point of the alloy. Of course, when you have, even though you might have a combination of aluminium and copper, and of course it is possible to vary the percentage of copper or the amount of copper to have a huge range of melting temperature, but when you take the average of those, so this is what you will end up with. For every this temperature here is nothing but the average of the wide range of alloys that are present in each of these categories. And as you can see, there is a significant difference in the melting temperature. Now, melting temperature is something that is relevant for metallography technique, because when you polish or do any other mechanical, when you involve mechanical processing during metallography, the temperature of the material will increase, and that is one of the reason why melting temperature is considered to be the one, even though it's a physical property, it is relevant to metallography. Now, depending on what we have seen is depending on the alloying element, on the person or the nature of the alloying element and the composition, the melting temperature varies. So depending on it, you have to be very careful about how high you are raising your alloying element, or you are raising your aluminium alloy when you are processing it. So depending on the melting or depending on the melting temperature, which is again dependent on the alloying element, you have to choose the right approach, or you have to be very careful how high the temperature of your sample is rising during metallography. So this is one of the reasons why we have to be aware of the melting temperature, or the different alloying elements, or different alloys that are present in the aluminium or that are formed from aluminium, and what are their physical properties and how different they are, because we tend to rise the temperature not only during mechanical processing, or it is also used during mounting. So in some cases, so it is necessary for us to understand the different average melting temperatures of the different aluminium alloys, so as not to work it close to its high temperature. Now, other properties that are relevant to us are quite obvious. That is, we have our hardness here, the other is the corrosion resistance. Now again, depending on the alloying element that constitute a particular aluminum alloy, the hardness of that alloy would vary. And now when you have a softer aluminum alloy, that means that you can no longer use mechanical polishing technique. You have to go for another alternate. It could either be the one best alternate for us is the electro polishing technique. So however, in the same aluminum alloys, there are other alloys, other combination of alloying elements that would present you another alloy which is quite hard, and you can use regular mechanical polishing techniques. And similar to melting point and the hardness, the corrosion resistance of the aluminum alloys also vary with regards or depending on the alloying elements that constitute this particular material. Now, for a given set of alloying elements, the given alloy would have, for a given set of alloying elements, the resulting alloy would have a definite corrosion resistance to definite external reagents, and for a different set of alloying elements, the corrosion resistance would vary. So the reason why we talk about corrosion resistance in the context of metallography is because I don't know, maybe we talked about it in the previous lecture, or you already would know that the etching can be viewed as a controlled corrosion, meaning the way we ensure that there is the contrast between different microstructural features when we look into the microstructure of an aluminum alloy is making sure that we have two different reaction rates for the different phases that are present in the microstructure, and this means that the corrosion properties of these phases should be different. And when you have a system like aluminum alloys wherein you have a wide range of composition, that means there will be a wide range of resulting phases, then the corrosion property of these phases would vary. So when you want to choose a particular etchant which would give you the controlled erosion, you have to be very sure about what are the phases that are present and what are the composition of these phases. Now, the reason we saw the different aluminum alloys, the different designations of it, or different alloying elements that characterize each of these designations is because with each of these alloying elements, these properties vary, and when you know which series and the properties for each of these series, then you would be able to choose the set of metallographical techniques in order for us to observe the microstructure. And the properties that are relevant to us are melting point, hardness, and corrosion resistance, and these properties they significantly vary with respect to or across the different alloys. And to put it more specific, depending on the alloying elements that constitute each of the aluminum alloys, these properties vary, and therefore you have to be very clear on choosing the appropriate metallographic techniques. Now moving on, like one of the property is hardness, and when you have a significant difference in the hardness, you cannot have a definite polishing technique for all of the aluminum alloys. We have to either, depending on the aluminum alloy, we have to first understand if it is hard or soft. If it is hard, you can go for the conventional polishing technique. If it is soft, because of its chemical makeup, then you have to go for electropolishing or chemical polishing. Now, the other aspects, like we have seen, the corrosion resistance would be different for the different combinations of or different chemical composition of the aluminum alloys, and therefore the etchants will also vary, or the combination of etchants will also vary. However, whereas when you talk about generally the aluminum alloys, there are few etchants that are prominent, that are commonly used, and these list of etchants are can be seen here. They are nitric acid, sulfuric acid, sodium hydroxide, and hydrofluoric acids. So these are some of the etchants that are commonly used, again commonly meaning for a definite aluminum alloy. So each of these etchants are used for a definite aluminum alloys, and since these are rather when you talk about several combination or a wide range of aluminum alloys, you would find at least one of these occurring as either a major component of the etchant or an additional component of the etchant, and that is the reason why we have chosen to present these four here. So these four, either they will form one of these four, either they will form the major component of the etchant, or you could find them at least an additional ingredient while etching the aluminum alloys. So these four, maybe when you want to be more specific, you will find that one of these four being present in the etchant. So these include nitric acid, sulfuric acid, sodium hydroxide and hydrofluoric acid. Now let's move on and see what are the characteristic microstructures that the aluminum alloys would offer or they would render. Now we have seen that the aluminum alloys, they are not rather confined. You have a wide range of composition in them, and that means that depending on the alloying elements that constitute a particular alloy, you have different properties, and you have to choose appropriate metallographic techniques in order to visualize the microstructure. Now, an additional aspect of having a different or a wide range of chemical composition is that the resulting phases will also be different, and the ways these phases appear in the microstructure will also be different. However, people who have studied aluminium before us, even though it is a quite recent alloy, people have studied it extensively and they have wonderfully categorized these different microstructure. This first one, or the simplest one could understand, is a single phase aluminium microstructure, which you can see here. It has no additional components in it, so all the alloying elements are dissolved completely, and this is you can find this commonly in pure aluminium or the first 1X series aluminium. And this, what we have seen here, is a single phase polycrystalline microstructure. So there are no different, or there are not more than one phases, and what the contrast that you see just comes from the grain boundaries. And this again, when you have your alloying element completely dissolved, you end up with a single phase microstructure, something like this. Now the other microstructure that is characteristics of aluminium is the precipitate microstructure. Here you have a definite compound that precipitates out of the aluminium matrix, and this is one of the characteristic microstructure that you would see in the aluminium alloys. And as you can see here, this precipitate are dispersed over the matrix, and they are not confined to a specific region, they are just dispersed, meaning if you have a polycrystalline dispersed precipitate microstructure, it means that these precipitate would be found within the grains. So they are dispersed all over the matrix of the aluminium, they don't have any specific points, and they can be found within the grain. So this is another characteristic microstructure that is observed in the aluminium alloys. It doesn't mean that it is only found in aluminium, but when we talk about aluminium alloys, this is more prevalent, and this helps us to differentiate, or this helps us to categorize a different set of microstructures. So whatever we see here in this particular investigation or study of the microstructure, it is not that this microstructure is only observed in aluminium. It is just a way for us to categorize the different microstructures, because again, aluminium has a wide range of chemical composition, and it will be really hard for us to get into each and every composition. And as you might already know, each and every composition it has its own phase diagrams, and depending on the phase diagrams, the phases it varies, and depending on the processing techniques, the form the phases assume will also vary. However, it is easy for us to categorize the microstructures that are hugely applicable, and that is what has already been done, and that is what we are looking at. So the microstructures that are available or that are used in applications, they have people have surveyed it and they have categorized it, and one of the category is monophase polycrystalline, we have seen that, and the other category is dispersed precipitate. Now the third category is similar to that of the dispersed precipitate, but these precipitate occupy a specific region in the microstructure, particularly they occupy the grain boundaries. And these precipitates, or this form of microstructure, is called as second phase network microstructures. And as you can see, these are definite precipitates. Here we have a wonderful schematic illustration to show what these dispersed second phase network microstructure looks like. You have your precipitates that are formed, and these precipitates are separate entities and they occupy the grain boundaries. And this is also another characteristic microstructure in case of the aluminium alloys. Now, the similar form of microstructure is observed, and in this case, instead of the second phase or the precipitate being a separate entities, these precipitate, they coalesce and form a continuous network. and this is what we see here. This category of microstructure is referred to as the continuous network of, or this is referred to as the continuous network microstructure, or categorized as continuous network microstructure. When you compare this with the second phase network or second phase network, what the difference is, in the second phase network, the particle, they were separate entities, they occupied the grain boundaries, but in case of continuous network, you in principle won't see any grain boundaries, but you have your precipitate that are continuous, and the other phase that forms islands between these continuous second phase. Of course, the second phase can be precipitate, they can also be other phases depending on the chemical composition of the alloying elements, or chemical composition of the aluminum alloys rather. And when your precipitates, instead of being separate or instead of the when your second phase, or rather the precipitates, instead of being separate entities occupying the grain boundaries, when they form a continuous network, and the other phase, it forms an island between these networks, then what the microstructure we have is a continuous network microstructure. Now ultimately, the final microstructure that we have in case of aluminum alloys, meaning when you categorize these microstructures definitely, and the final category of during this categorization, the final category of microstructure that we have in aluminum alloys is the duplex microstructure. So in this microstructure, the way we would characterize this microstructure is that it is a polycrystalline microstructure, and instead of crystals having the homogeneous chemical composition here, or instead of each grains having an homogeneous chemical composition, each specific grains in these crystals are associated with a specific phase. So if you can see here, there is this grain associated with one phase, the other grain associated with the other phase. So when you have a microstructure wherein your precipitate, it forms an independent grain of its own. Your precipitate is not an entity that is just dispersed within the grain. It is not an entity that is aligned along a separate entity that is along the grain boundary. It is not a continuous network, but rather this precipitate forms a grain of its own. In that case, when I say precipitate, it's the second phase, so it forms a grain of its own. Then what you have is a duplex microstructure, and this is also observed in the aluminum alloys. So what we have is, when you look into the microstructure of aluminum alloys that are used in several applications, you can categorize these microstructures, and what you have to begin with, you have a single phase polycrystalline microstructure. In this case, there are no additional phases, and every alloying elements are completely dissolved, and you just have the contrast comes from the grain boundary. So what you end up having is a monophase polycrystalline microstructure. And the other category of microstructure is the dispersed microstructure, or dispersed precipitate microstructure. Here you would find the precipitates occupying are found within the grain. They do not occupy a specific position, they are found within the grain. And the other two are the second phase and the continuous network. In both these cases, the second phase, they occupy a definite region. In case of the second phase network, these precipitates, they are separate entities occupying the grain boundaries. But in case of continuous network, the second phase, it forms, or rather the first phase, they become an island, and the second phase become a network. And that is how we differentiate the second phase network and the continuous network of the aluminum alloys. Now the final microstructure is the duplex microstructure. Here the precipitate, instead of being present, instead of assuming a position or assuming a place within the grain or along the grain boundary, it forms a grain of its own, and that way it forms what we now call as a duplex microstructure. So these are the different categories of microstructure that is found in the aluminum alloys. And when you come across an aluminum alloy, when you try to find a structural component or any component made up of aluminum in your day-to-day application, if you polish it, generally the microstructure this particular material that you have found in the application, you find that there is a aluminum component in application that you are using. You take that component, polish it, and observe its microstructure. In generally, that microstructure would be one of these microstructures that we have seen. So with this, I would like to wind up this lecture. And the reason why, instead of looking into the different microstructure, we saw just the categories of it, is because you would be ultimately able to relate the microstructure that you observe in the real life with one of these. So thanks for your time, and let's see ourselves in the next lecture. Goodbye.